words on that reconciliation. All three brothers love their father, and he's brought them here today to see these papers and these lawyers and divide the old estate. All three feel that they're the favorite. He loves each of them the best, and these documents he gave them will now put them to the test. So they open all the writings that will prove the rightful heir to this home that they remember, and the right to settle there. Their own sister is a prisoner. They don't see her face to face. They've not heard her song of beauty, nor felt the movement of her grace. She lives behind those bars of steel and waits for her release. Will she die, or will we see Jerusalem in peace? These lyrics open David Wilcox's song, Three Brothers. It's a song which has been one of the most powerful in my young life for framing the complexities around our people's holy city and our homeland, the land of Israel. As I'm sure many of you gathered only from that short stanza, the three brothers in the song are, of course, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, all of whom lay claim to the same city and that same holy land. The lyrics are a commentary about how the true holiness of Jerusalem is caged up in a prison and is slowly dying, as Jerusalem's faithful debate over who ought to take possession and claim authority over her. I lived in Jerusalem for a year during my first year of rabbinical school. It was far from my first time visiting the city, but frankly, that's all any prior experience was, a visit. Before the 2015-2016 school year, my understanding of Jerusalem was like, well, imagine walking into a relative's house for a holiday or a special occasion and assuming that just by knowing them as family and seeing familiar faces and pictures on the walls, that you knew everything that had gone on in that house since you last visited. I imagine that's the illusion that most short visits to Israel or to Jerusalem pulls over the eyes of the visitor. But in reality, it's impossible to truly grasp the complex nature of the city's culture and subcultures on a 12-day Jewish Federation family mission or a 10-day birthright trip. Now, I don't say this to disparage those kinds of excursions. They're important. They're vital pieces of diaspora Jewish life because they're some of the few lines of connection that we can create with Israel when we don't live there ourselves. My sister actually just got home from a birthright trip, so I'm looking forward anxiously to hearing about how it went. And these trips, they provide an invaluable service to those of us who live in a diaspora Jewish community. They help us establish our Jewish identities, and they also might even help us to engage in the Jewish community. Some are even designed to facilitate charitable giving and philanthropy. All of these are very, very valuable endeavors. I simply mean to say, by bringing these trips up, that this kind of experience can't give someone the true feeling of what it means to be Yerushalmi, to be a Jerusalemite. Now, I can't honestly stand before you and claim that I truly know what that means. After all, while a year is much more substantial than, say, one of those 12 or 10-day trips, it's by far insufficient to claim that as an identity. But I can, however, more deeply understand what that experience is like more than I ever could before. In Jerusalem, hundreds, if not thousands, of different subcultures live right on top of one another and interact with each other constantly. They're wide-ranging. They vary by the language they speak, the generation they're mostly made up of, the part of town they live in, the religion they follow, the prophets they listen to, the politicians they vote for, and the families that they comfort and are comforted by, and, frankly, the hummus they eat. It's important stuff when you live in Jerusalem, which hummus joint. But despite what you might have seen in the news or on the internet, more than 90% of the time, these interactions are friendly, brotherly, or at least civil. And yet, after thousands of years of trying, the city of Jerusalem simply cannot seem to break the cycle of violence that it seems to engender. Don't let anyone convince you that it's only since the creation of the modern state of Israel that violence has plagued those who live in Jerusalem. This is miles from reality. It's a ludicrous statement. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is just the most modern incarnation of a cycle which has been plaguing this city long before there even was a Christianity to speak of, for example. All of this brings me to this week's Torah portion, to Vayigash. Vayigash is a story of reconciliation, right? Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery in Egypt. He'd been sexually assaulted, put through hard labor, jailed, but ultimately rose above it all to become Pharaoh's right-hand man and Egypt's savior during a time of famine. Now, upon hearing that their youngest brother Benjamin had been jailed by Joseph, his brothers make a plea to take them in his stead. And upon realizing who these men were, Benjamin's brothers, Joseph reveals to them his identity. And they fall on their faces in shame and sorrow over their actions toward him. And Joseph responds, however, comforting them, saying, "It wasn't you who sent me here, but God. It has all been ordained from above to save us and the entire region from famine." The story of Vayigash is accompanied by yet another story of reconciliation, which we find in this week's Haftarah. After the rule of King Solomon, the Israelite kingdom in Judah was divided into two kingdoms: Israel in the north, which was made up of the tribes that actually descended from Joseph, and Judah in the south, which was the rest of the tribes. Ezekiel, who's the prophet that the Haftarah originates from, is told by God to inscribe the name of the northern kingdom on one stick and the southern kingdom on another, and place them next to each other. In a prophetic miracle, the two sticks merge together. They fuse into one stick, and God promises an eventual reunion of the two disparate kingdoms. This promise has not been fulfilled. Rather than uniting two kingdoms who've spurned one another, there is more division in the land of Israel than ever. After the destruction of the temple and the rise of the rabbis, many traditions started to emerge. It started with just the rabbis who were staying in Palestine and the rabbis who were in Babylonia, but that morphed and expanded into different schools of law and thought, different feelings on prayer and on practice, and ultimately back into sectarianism, which was the culture which, according to legend, led to the temple being destroyed in the first place. The divides between liberal Jews and ultra-Orthodox Jews have never, ever been wider. In an increasingly small world, never has it seemed so impossible to truly learn from one another. I have friends who are in Israel right now, and they're protesting alongside members of Women of the Wall, that movement that is advocating for egalitarianism at the Kotel Plaza. And I have often struggled to understand how a reality so intolerant could exist, in which a movement like that would even be necessary. But I imagine that my incredulousness is equally matched by the incredulousness of the ultra-Orthodox, obviously from a very different perspective than my own. But this kind of dichotomy exists on almost every single issue. You name it. The settlements in the West Bank that have been built on the other side of the Green Line since the war in 1967. Muslim Arabs serving as members of the Knesset. Even whether restaurants should be allowed to be open on Shabbat. All this division and all these barriers to discussion exist. And these are just the ones between the Jews. I didn't even mention the ones that divide us from the other religious groups who feel like they have an equally important role to play in these kinds of discussions. So why am I talking to you about Jerusalem and about Israel? Well, just a short couple of weeks ago, might be a couple weeks by now, a United Nations resolution was passed with an abstention from the United States, which fully condemns Israel with regard to the settlements. This resolution goes against the entirety of the history of Israel and the Palestinian national movement because it takes the power of negotiation out of the hands of the parties involved. Instead, it's the UN which has decided to choose which side is right and which side is wrong. Totally without a fully nuanced understanding of the history, I would argue. I'm not a fan of this resolution for this reason, and this reason alone, the reason that the power to negotiate has been removed from the parties that involved. That's the reason I'm against it. Let me be clear. I'm not a fan of the settlements either, far from it, but I won't remain silent, however, while the power of negotiation, of talking to and understanding our cousins, is taken out of our hands by a panel. That's my issue. It's not the settlements. That's a whole other debate. But when you take away our power of negotiation, that's where I feel like I have to draw a line. More than ever, this resolution has made us like the brothers in the lawyer's office, dividing up the estate of our father, while the true beauty, the true holiness, which must be preserved, is locked away, kept out of the discussion. This resolution will only further silo the relevant parties and make it increasingly difficult, if not, I fear, impossible, to apologize meaningfully to one another and move beyond conflict. If Jerusalem and the land of Israel is to be freed of this cycle of violence and hatred, it will be because we and them, us brothers or cousins or however you'd like to imagine our groups with histories so deeply intertwined, if we stand up and insist upon tolerance. We must stand up and insist upon pluralism. We must stand up and insist upon legitimate, open democracy and diplomacy, not on hate speech, not on incitement, and not on double talk. Both parties have been guilty at many occasions in the history of this conflict of these exact failures. And both, ourselves included, need to find a way to be honest with one another and direct that honesty both outwardly and inwardly. As Joseph reminds us, it is possible that God has ordained us to be in this land together. And so maybe it's no one's fault. Rather, if we can see past our anger, this way we've been forced upon each other might ultimately be for a truly holy purpose. For Joseph's story, it was to save an entire nation from famine, starvation. For us, it may be for an even grander, if more abstract purpose, for peace. I'll close my words tonight with the end of David Wilcox's desperate plea for mutual tolerance. Jerusalem is sending her voice from inside the prison of disbelief. Stand up, you people of the one God, and bring about her release. Stand up, you people of the one God, and bring about her release. We will